If you have ever flown in an airplane, you might be familiar with the safety instructions they always give. Among those instructions is what to do in the case of an emergency. They tell you an oxygen mask will fall down from the panel above your seat. And then they tell you to make sure you do what? Put on your oxygen mask before assisting others. Wait, does that sound selfish? Is it selfish? Why do they give that instruction? Put on your oxygen mask before assisting others. It's for good reason, right? It's not selfish at all. Why? Why do they give those instructions? Because if you do not make sure you get oxygen, you might pass out and make it much more difficult for others. And you cannot assist anyone else if you don't have oxygen. So it's not selfish at all. That might be obvious, but when it comes to love, some claim that any self-interest is unloving. Specifically, there is a common teaching that true love, at least the kind God has, only gives but never receives. Now, it is true that love gives. God is love, and God is the great giver. You could never outgive God. But is it true that love never receives? What do you think? Some go one step further and say receiving itself is selfish. But is it? Well, sometimes it is. If you're putting your own interests above others, and in our world we have far too many takers and not enough givers. But is it always selfish to receive? Let me ask a different question. Does God receive anything? Well, Scripture does teach that God takes delight in His people. Consider Proverbs 15. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is His delight. The way of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but He loves one who pursues righteousness. In Isaiah 62 verse 4, God proclaims to His people, "You shall no longer be termed forsaken, nor shall your land any more be termed desolate. But you shall be called Hephzibah, and your land Beulah, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married." And a personal favorite of mine, Zephaniah 3:17, speaks of the day when God rescues His people to be with Him. And it says of Him on that day, "The Lord your God in your midst, the mighty one, will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you with His love. He will rejoice over you with singing or shouts of joy." So clearly, God takes delight in His people, right? But if that is the case, whatever else we say, it cannot be that taking delight in someone else is intrinsically selfish or unloving. For God Himself does it, and God is love. Is God selfish to delight in us then? Of course not. But one might ask, isn't love supposed to be purely selfless and manifest in pure self-sacrifice? Now, that kind of thinking is a good example of taking something good, which is subjection of self to serve others and to sacrifice in the appropriate circumstances, and universalizing it as if it is the essence of love itself. One of the most common metaphors of love in Scripture, the marriage metaphor, provides key insights for us. In Ephesians 5 verse 25, two dual metaphors are presented. The church is presented as Christ's bride and His own body when Paul states, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself up for her. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of His body." When I married my wife, I became one with her, such that her interests are to be intrinsic to my interests. Similarly, God identifies with our best interests voluntarily and makes them part of His own interests. In these parallel metaphors of love, then, the giver, Christ, receives by giving. The self-sacrificial love of Christ in dying for the church, that she might be redeemed as His bride, is bound up with His proper and unselfish self-interest. That is, His love for His metaphorical body, the church. This is not selfishness. It is the ideal of love, where love relationship brings joy to the beloved and to the lover. You see, my life is intimately affected by what happens to my wife. My joy is tied to her joy and vice versa. Even so, God's life is intimately affected by the lives of His children. Our joy is integral to God's own joy. Nevertheless, some argue that any divine self-interest detracts from the purity of God's love. However, I believe that proper self-interest, not selfishness, but proper self-interest makes God's self-sacrificial love even more amazing. Just think about it. If God has no self-interest, then He has no interest to sacrifice for us. That is, if it were true that nothing can actually add to or subtract from God's happiness, in what sense could any sacrifice be made by God? However, Scripture depicts God as voluntarily binding His own happiness to that of His creatures, culminating in the ultimate manifestation of God's love at the cross. God's self-sacrifice, then, is far greater than it would be if God had no interest to sacrifice in the first place. God actually suffers and sacrifices for us willingly because He so desires to save us and to welcome us home. That is amazing love. While self-sacrifice is virtuous in the appropriate circumstances, it is not the ideal that everyone always sacrifice themselves, right? This much should be obvious. Recall the safety guidelines when traveling in a plane. Put on your oxygen mask before assisting others. Why? Because you can't assist any others if you don't have oxygen. Imagine a world wherein every individual always acts only self-sacrificially. When two people arrive at the same door, what do they do in such a world? Well, they both insist on holding the door open for the other. One says, "After you," but the other says, "No, after you," and neither ever enters. If everyone acts only self-sacrificially all the time, there would be no one to receive the benefits of self-sacrifice at all. So self-sacrifice cannot be God's ideal because it cannot possibly serve as an ultimate end of other interest. If God were to sacrifice His very existence, then no others would exist, since all existence is dependent upon God. Thus, the suggestion that God's love is essentially sacrificial is self-defeating. Is it selfish when a mother or father takes delight in their young child? Of course not. Assuming God's love is essentially self-sacrificial overlooks the fact that God is worthy of all praise, of all worship, of all exaltation, and all love. The tragedy of the cross is not an end in itself, but a means to the greater end of God's reconciliation with His beloved creatures. Indeed, Jesus Himself, the author and finisher of our faith, for the joy set before Him, endured the cross. How can we apply this understanding to our lives? Well, again, we have far too many receivers and far too few givers in our world. So we should be givers. But we should at the same time recognize that love itself is like a never-ending circuit. The more you give, the more joy you will receive. Not in a selfish way, but because God designed love to expand and grow and never cease. That is a wonderful thought. You cannot give too much love. Where love is given, it only grows more and more. If you have not experienced this, ask God to fill your heart today and commit to reflecting His love to others wherever you can.